It's episode 9 of Podcast Local from On The Go FM.
When you have a small community, each person in that community plays a very major role in making that community great. And without, this person, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Or this person, got inspired from this person. And it just becomes a chain effect where each person is really what's making the city great. And we need to kind of spotlight those people and give them a chance to tell their story. And that's what I try to do, one episode at a time.
That's Chris Holifield from I Am Salt Lake, a local podcast for Salt Lake City, Utah. Chris has been podcasting local for 4.5 years, and he's on his way to 300 episodes in 2017. Quick question. What do you think is the most important measure of a successful local podcast? If you said download numbers or sponsorships, I would respectfully disagree. I believe the most important measure, or at least it's in the top 3, is audience engagement. Chris has that. And if you listen to this whole interview, you'll pick up some insights and advice that will help you grow your own local podcast. I'm Jason Norris, and this show features both solo and interview episodes. Listen to ideas and techniques for local podcasting, along with conversations with local podcasters from around the world. Support for Podcast Local comes from the Satchel Podcast Player. If you're a local podcaster, there are features that will help you. Discover more at satchelplayer.com. What is your day job? Because, in a way, when it comes to podcasters, it's sort of like superheroes. They are their alter ego during their regular work, but then they become superheroes when they're podcasters.
So by day, I work in a granite and marble slab warehouse.
Wow.
Where we import big slabs of granite, and we have to unload them from these giant metal containers, load them on these big trucks to be shipped out, Idaho, Wyoming, Utah, down to even Nevada, for installers to cut them and install them into countertops. So that's my job. I've been doing it. I've been there for 10.5 years.
Okay.
And I've hated every moment of it. And it's kind of funny because I, for some reason, have just kind of stayed there. I mean, it's been a somewhat easy job, and they recently have sold, some new people bought it, and they're kind of shifting the company in a different direction. So I'm actually trying to figure out, well, how can I take I Am Salt Lake and actually do more of that full time to help myself get out of my day job. So... so that's my day job, and it's kind of a job that just fell in my lap. Before that, I was selling full-time on eBay, and I was a vintage clothing seller, and my life kind of switched and shifted, and this other job fell in my lap in the big housing boom back in 2006, and pays the bills. So
what are vintage clothes?
Well, like, clothes from the 60s or 70s, and I would go to estate sales and yard sales and thrift stores and anywhere that, and go buy an old butterfly collar button-up shirt or some old bell-bottom corduroys or an old concert shirt from the 80s and then sell it online on eBay. And I was doing that for about 3.5 years, but I didn't have health insurance.
Oh, right.
And at the time, I needed to get health insurance. And it made a lot more sense for me to get a regular job. And so I got the job at where I'm at, got my health insurance, and stuff kind of changed in life. I went through a divorce and all of that as I was working there. And it was an easy job through all that because I didn't have to think much, and my brain was in other areas of life. And now my life has kind of calmed down quite a bit, and I'm ready to take on new adventures, so to speak. So I'm a man that's always, I've always had different ideas. When I was younger, I did a record label. I printed my own magazine. I had my own online business, and then here I Am Salt Lake started, almost summer of 2012. So I'm always kind of creating, always kind of thinking up new ideas and kind of how to do my own thing. So that's the story in a nutshell.
So what kind of magazine did you start?
I was about 17 years old, so that was close to 20 years ago. I used to really be involved with animal rights and veganism and, the whole activist. I ran with a bunch of kids that were called straight edge. I don't know if you've ever heard of that terminology, where we didn't do drugs, we didn't, smoke, drink, any of that stuff, which the idea is great. I mean, everybody wants their kids to live a very clean lifestyle and, not get drunk and not drink, do drugs and smoke cigarettes at, 17, 18, 19 years old. And so I got really involved in it. And then a lot of the kids, we started going vegetarian and vegan and, trying to kind of, live a very pure life and not put garbage in our body and, not consume animals. And I got really involved with like the activist side of it. And so I started publishing a paper magazine, an actual print magazine where I would go to Kinko's, print them out. I'd write articles in it. I'd have different people submit articles to it. And then I had like a whole circulation network worldwide that people, I just found them through other people that were doing, they called them fanzines. And I had a pretty good distribution of that. Went to, that was the first time I ever visited the East Coast. I went to a big animal rights march out at the White House. And so that was a big part of my life. And since then, I'm not really involved in all of that anymore, but it's still a big part of my life. I'm not vegan or vegetarian now, but so I've always been creating, and I actually, I wanted to start a record label. I actually started a record label where I found some local, or not local, well, there was some local bands. Then there was a band from Seattle. I actually, produced and put out their record, an actual vinyl record, and distributed that to record stores and music stores, and so I've always just kind of been that way. I've always just kind of wanted to create and see what would happen and see where it would take me in life.
Would you say that in your heart, you're an artist?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. An artist at heart. But I've never been like good at drawing. I've never really, I've taken music lessons my entire life, but I never really got a passion for creating music. So, but I always wanted to give back, whether it was whatever community that I was part of, and whether it's, animal rights or, Salt Lake City with I Am Salt Lake. It's like I want to give something back because I feel like the community has given so much to me that I find a way to give a little bit of myself back to it. And again, not playing in a band or being an artist, I feel like podcasting is my artistic tool now.
That's really cool. I think deep down I am too. My tools are digital, and the canvas is it's been either the screen or, in this case, for the ear, writing for the ear and podcasting. And there's a need for that in podcasting, to have that open so that you can create, even if you don't get a sponsor, and even if you can't make that, but to have a kind of hobby in which you are able to use your voice, use your editing talents, whatever it might be, to communicate.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
So you had written this on Facebook, and you had made a comment about that. You said that podcasting is your passion. It's all you really think about. From the time you wake up in the morning to the moment you go to bed, I think of how to make the podcast better, who to bring on the show, and what direction to take it. And
sure.
Yeah, that resonated with me about podcasting itself being a passion. And I was just wondering if you could elaborate on your thoughts on that.
Well, it's pretty much that. The moment I wake up, I'm thinking, okay, what can I do today? Who can I reach out to? Who can I email? what Facebook group can I post in, or, what tweets should I post on Twitter or Instagram pictures, or, even what podcast can I listen to that maybe will offer inspiration to me to create a better show. And I mean, that's virtually all I think about all day, every day. And it's sometimes I get sick of it because it's like, why can't I just be like the next person who all they worry about is if their football team is winning, or who's going to play the Super Bowl, or who's going to play, the World Series. And it's like, none of that stuff matters to me. All I care about and all I think about, and the only articles I read online are about podcasting. And it's like, that is proof that that's where my heart is, and that's what I'm passionate about. It's been this way for, I would say, close to 6 years when I started getting into podcasting, when I decided I wanted to do a podcast. That's really how it's been for me. And it hasn't left, and it hasn't, if anything, it's intensified throughout the last 6 years.
Okay, let's talk about your origin story then as a podcaster. Well, first of all, is I Am Salt Lake your first podcast?
It is my first podcast. It's the first podcast I ever did. I didn't know anything about podcasting when I started. Well, I learned, I taught myself everything. But yes, I Am Salt Lake is my first podcast.
So why did you decide to podcast local in this case, instead of choosing some other kind of niche?
I got introduced to podcasting through some friends of mine that do a podcast. They actually still do their podcast to this day. But we would go to barbecues and get-togethers, and they were talking about this podcast that they did. I wasn't very familiar with podcasting at this time. I would say it was probably, late 2010, 2011. Started researching it a little bit. Well, what is this podcast they did? And it was like, okay, it's kind of like radio. And I was like, well, I've always enjoyed talk radio. I've always, when I was younger, I would pretend I was, a DJ or something like that with my friends. So I started, checking it out. I, downloaded through iTunes, started looking into podcasts, and started, listening to more and more podcasts. And at this time, I was kind of burned out of music. I love music, but I felt like there was nothing original out there. I felt like it just wasn't really, touching my soul like it used to. And so I started consuming a lot of podcasts, discovering, more and more. And I'm like, man, I really want to give this whole podcast thing a try, but what do I do it about? I was like, we live in Salt Lake City. It's not like there's a ton of celebrities coming through the city that I could interview, but I knew I wanted to do a podcast that was in person. It wasn't like, phone interviews or Skype interviews. I wanted that connection, that, face-to-face connection. And I was married at this time, and the girl I was with, she sold at a lot of the local markets. She makes handmade women's clothing. So I was very involved in the local craft community. I would help her set up her booth at the farmers market and different events like that. And I during this time, I used to wander the streets of Salt Lake taking pictures on Instagram, buildings of graffiti, street art, stuff like that. So I was building a little bit of audience at this time with doing that, people that either have moved away from Salt Lake or that still lived here, but I was kind of showing Salt Lake through a different angle. So I was noticing this. I was like, wow, people, they love this city. They love Salt Lake. And I was tossing different podcast ideas to my ex-wife, my wife at the time. And I was like, what if I was to do a podcast where I interviewed people in Salt Lake? People love all the pictures that I take. What if I was to take that a step further and bring those pictures to life through an interview? Introducing people to the business owners, introducing people to the people at farmers markets that, have a day job, but their passion project maybe is to, make soap or candles or food or whatever. Anyway, she really loved the idea. She's like, this is a great idea. You should do it. And the rest is kind of history. I started, I was researching podcasts a little bit, how to do it, because that's the type of person I am, where I'll just try to figure things out myself. And the first 3 interviews, the first 3 episodes were mostly actually recorded on my iPhone. And then after that, I bought a microphone, plugged in one microphone into my laptop, and, we shared a microphone. So pretty much each episode, I realized more and more like, okay, this is something I want to do. This is something I want to stick with. So I bought more and more equipment, digging into my own pocket. And honestly, it was never, it was just kind of going to be a little bit of a project. It was kind of, a lot of people get into podcasting and they're like, oh, they look at it like a business venture. They're like, okay, how can I monetize with this? Mm-hmm. And that was really never my end goal at that time. It was like, I just want to meet people, find out their story, record it, put it up on iTunes, and people would listen. And a lot of people were kind of like, well, this is going to be a tough thing for you because not a lot of people listen to podcasts, and not a lot of people in Salt Lake City listen to podcasts. And I was like, I don't even care if only, 20 people listen to this. I think it'll be a really cool project. And very quickly, it blew up. I got a lot of awards my first year of doing the show. I got a lot of write-ups in local magazines, and it just exploded. And I said, well, maybe there's something to this. Maybe I have something here, that I didn't realize was here. And actually, to back up a little bit, when I first started the show, I was doing 2 episodes a week, which is crazy if you think about it. But I kind of followed the footsteps of a lot of the big podcasts out there. A lot of the big podcasts were doing, 2 or 3 episodes a week. And I was like, if this is how I want my audience to grow, then this is what I have to do. And I figured, each person that came on the show, they would share it to their audience, through Facebook or Twitter or whatever social media was popular at the time. And it really just took off and kind of created its own. And that's one thing. Another thing that I've done with the podcast too is I've never really fought it. I've let it kind of mold into what it is. I've had ideas and I've had kind of direction that I wanted to take it, but for the most part, I've kind of just, let's see what happens with it. Let's see what crowd really takes on to it. Which type of people latch on to the idea. And so it's kind of been interesting to see, the different music genres, and, the local comedy scene has been very, they've embraced it, and certain groups like that. And it's just really, it's been a lot of fun to kind of see it turn into what it is today after doing it for 4.5 years now.
Yeah, actually, I was planning to ask you a question about your plans for the show even before you started, and but this sounds like it was just let's see where it goes.
Well, exactly. I didn't know. I just thought, well, if I could make money from it, back then, I think a lot of podcasters just kind of, they did it, and if somebody reached out and offered to be a sponsor, then that's what happened. People, I don't know, a lot of the podcasters that I knew, at least the vibe they gave was like, well, you don't reach out to people to ask them to be a sponsor. You let them come to you. And so I just thought, well, this is fun. Even if I never get a sponsor, I love it. I love Salt Lake City. I love doing the show. And as time has gone on, a lot of that has changed. If you were to ask me today, where do I see the podcast, or what would I like to do with the podcast, it would be a much different story.
Well, actually, could you talk about that a little bit? What would you like to do with the show now? What kinds of plans are you making?
Well, one thing I've realized is no matter how passionate you are, or how much you love it, or how much I love doing this podcast, it takes a lot of time. It takes a lot of time and energy, it takes a lot of money. And a lot of people don't realize that. A lot of people that listen to the show, I have listeners that they just think, oh, wow, this is a good sounding show. he probably makes, I actually had a guy tell me one time he thought I was making over 6 figures a year from the podcast.
Really?
Kind of, it blew me away. But so one thing I've realized, I'm almost 40 years old, and the older I get, the more time I want to spend with family and friends and whatnot. And I'm like, this gets very exhausting to have a day job and then to come home at night and work on podcast stuff. I personally would like this to turn into a full-time job for me. And I think a lot of people kind of make you feel bad if you want to do that. There's a group of podcasters, and I'm sure you've seen it online especially, that they feel, well, if you do a podcast, it should just be a hobby. It shouldn't be anything that you make money from. You should just love to do it, and that's it. And I think there's a lot to be said about that, and there's nothing wrong with that. But at the same time, I think if you want to do a good quality show, if you want to be consistent, if you want to have, a good place to record, you want to have good equipment, if you want to actually be able to sit down and think of good show content, it kind of needs to be your full-time job. I believe that. Because otherwise, you're just going to burn out. And I don't think that there's anything wrong with it being your full-time job. Again, a lot of people that podcast make you feel like you shouldn't even think that way. At least a lot of people I know. And so I've kind of shifted my mind a lot. I've really had to train my mind to say, you know what, this is where my heart is. This is what I'm passionate with. I couldn't imagine, like I've talked to my fiance, Chrissy, and I said, I couldn't imagine just stopping doing the show. What would I do? I mean, this is my life. I know other things, but this is where my heart is. If this was to die, a huge part of me would die. So I have to figure out, either I have to, help it swim, or if the show sank, a big part of me would sink with it. So to make a long story short, I would love for it to create it into something that could pay my bills. I could pay back to the podcast. I can make sure I always have top-notch equipment, top-notch shows, and provide excellent content for the people of Salt Lake City.
I was curious, could you describe how the level of engagement with your show from the listeners has grown since all the way back to your very first I Am Salt Lake episode? I mean, what was it like in the beginning? And then when did you feel like it was starting to really work like you hoped it would?
In the beginning, I knew people were listening. I mean, obviously you could see, I use Libsyn, so you could see the download numbers, and you could see, people are consuming the content. People were leaving reviews on iTunes and on Stitcher Radio and all of those outlets. So I knew people were listening, but I never got really a lot of engagement. So it would get very discouraging. It would get very like, well, this is a very one-sided conversation. And, occasionally I would run into somebody on the streets that would listen to the podcast, but it got kind of old. And I would say maybe over the last 2 years, I decided to take my social media up a notch and include more of myself into it. I didn't even post a lot of pictures of myself. A lot of people didn't even know what I looked like online. It's just the way I was. I'm typically, I keep to myself, but I just didn't know how to put myself out there. And so over the last couple of years, I've really just decided to put myself out there through Facebook and Twitter, reaching out to people, sending people messages, and kind of trying to even be the first person to engage with people. Don't sit back and wait for people to message you. Message them first. Hey, what did you think of that show? What did you think of it? So since doing this, my engagement with listeners has been incredible. I mean, it's still, of course, it could be a lot better. I would love for a lot more engagement with listeners. I think all podcasters would. But I think you have to put yourself out there a little bit. You can't just put an episode out and sit back and wait for your email box to get filled up. You have to kind of put yourself out there and kind of strike the conversation, begin the conversation online, begin the conversation in person. When a person runs into you when you're out and about, especially doing a local show, I mean, you're going to run into listeners. Somebody tells you they listen to your show, don't just say thank you. I mean, obviously you want to tell them thanks, but ask them, well, what do you like about it? What was your favorite episode? Who should I bring on the show? You want to keep that conversation going. Don't end the conversation there. You want to keep them going. Oh, add me on Facebook. Add me on Twitter. Oh, here, let's, everybody, we all got our smartphones in our pockets. Have them pull their smartphone out. Oh, what's your name on Facebook? Add them right there. That way there's no excuses. Keep that conversation going. Keep engaged with them, and you'll have a listener for life if you do that. That's what I believe.
It's interesting, as I've followed you on Facebook, that some of the questions or statements, comments, various status updates, that some of them just seem just somewhat innocuous, just a little comment here. And then I'll notice there's like 70 replies, 70 comments on your status update. Are these people who follow, are they mostly folks from Salt Lake?
Yeah, and I've purposely have created that with my Facebook, where automatically people that are come on the show, I'll add them on Facebook, and then they'll their friends will add me. Sometimes I'll even just go through their friends. Okay, they live in Salt Lake. I'll add them as a friend, and so I've tried to kind of create this Salt Lake community on Facebook. I know a lot of people get kind of weird about Facebook, and I always find that very interesting. They're very private, they don't want their posts to be seen, and I make all my posts public. That way they're all shareable. Again, it goes back to being transparent. It goes back to, not hiding anything. It's like, hey, you know what? I want to be an open book. And so I think a lot of people, the word gets out, hey, follow this Chris guy on Facebook, and he talks a lot about Salt Lake City, and check out his podcast. But I would say probably a good 90% of Facebook friends are Salt Lake City people. And I would say, a good 80% of those are listeners of the show.
Well, I saw recently you got a sponsor that you were very excited about and talking about. Is this the first sponsor for the show?
I've had numerous sponsors, but nothing substantial like my recent sponsor with Jed's. I've had sponsors where they will pay me, a lump sum, maybe, a few $100s or $50 to do, one thing, or, do a month or a couple months. But with Jed's, it's like he kind of wants to be, he's like, hey, I want to support your show and financially help you out. And so we recently got an office space, because that was one of my biggest struggles with doing I Am Salt Lake, is I just never had a place to record. I've never really been able to figure that part out. And so we kind of eventually, Chrissy and myself, my co-host, my fiance, who co-hosts the podcast with me now, she's like, let's just get an office space that we'll have a place to record. And I was concerned about the financial part of it. I was like, well, that's an extra bill again. And she's like, we'll figure it out. We'll figure it out. And Jed stepped up. I'm good friends with the owner, with Jed. And he's really been a big fan of the podcast. And he's like, hey, I want to sponsor your show. I want to be able to, pay for the rent of the office and all the, other things that go along with it. That way I don't have to keep digging into my pocket to pay for, the hosting or the website or the office space or internet or any of that. He takes care of all that. But I've done sponsors, trade sponsors. I actually, a couple summers ago, CenturyLink actually reached out to me, and I was on a commercial of theirs, which was a really cool opportunity. And, I was able to make some money doing that. And it was great exposure for the podcast. So I've had different people through the last 4 years, but nothing to the magnitude that Jed's Barbershop has been able to provide for the show. So it's been really nice. A lot of pressure has been taken off of my shoulders. Again, it's not enough to quit the day job. It's just enough to pay the immediate bills, but it's been nice.
It's progress.
Exactly. And I've never wanted to fill the podcast up with a bunch of ads. Mm-hmm. I've never really wanted to do that. But how else do you fund a podcast without putting a couple sponsors on your show?
Yeah, it's one of those things that I was thinking about back when I lived in Fort Worth, and it was like, yes, sponsorships, that would be very helpful to cover the costs of this. But yeah, if you spend, half your show talking about the various sponsors you have, then it doesn't seem like it would be quite as entertaining of a show.
Well, exactly. And it's not fair to the listeners. But again, especially if you're doing a local podcast, it's not like a lot of these local businesses can pay that much money. You know what I mean? They can't pay you thousands and thousands of dollars like if you were to do a big show that you could get like a big corporate sponsor that might pay you, $1 million or something like that. But and so that's been a struggle too, because a lot of the mom and pop shops, they don't have a budget for that kind of stuff. So what do? I've never felt comfortable, reaching out to big names. Like I think a small local show would look kind of silly if it was sponsored by Walmart, or something like that. And so what do? And you can luck out, and if a local business has some extra advertising dollars, and maybe they'll step up to the plate and help you out.
One thing that I noticed about this, you have interviews, with musicians and artists and that sort of thing, but sometimes you talk to people in businesses, right, that own local businesses?
Correct.
How do you differentiate talking about, say, your sponsor now from other times that you've interviewed business owners? Because I could see, in a way, it's sort of, if you're not careful, they could potentially sound like advertisements.
Correct. I think it would be tough to bring on another barber shop, right? Is that kind of what you mean? Like they would butt heads?
Well, yeah, I could see that too. But no, I was just wondering, like, is there something in your style or whatever you want to call it that if you go tomorrow and you talk to some local business owner, it is promoting them in a way. It's giving them free sponsorship, if you want to call it that.
But I think one thing I'm trying to do with I Am Salt Lake is I'm trying to actually find out about the individual. I want to find out where they were born, where they were raised, how they got, even as a small child, what did you want to be when you grew up? What are you interested in? What kind of obstacles did you face with the business? So it's not always necessarily just focusing on the business. I'm finding out about that person. Does that make sense? So let's say somebody came in here, they opened up a flower shop. We're not going to just sit here and talk about all the flowers that are in the flower shop. I'm going to find out about them. What did you go to school for? What other, what was the most memorable concert that you've ever been to? Those things kind of reflect on the person, and then you can actually know that person when you go to the flower shop versus just going into the flower shop and you see the person behind the cash register. I want to give the people of Salt Lake an opportunity to get to know that person. So yeah, they might mention their flower shop, where to go, the address, their hours, their website, how to find them on Facebook. But through the podcast, you're actually going to get to know that person. You're going to get to know how they spent their 21st birthday. Maybe you're going to find out what their favorite books are, or their favorite, movies or something like that, without focusing so much just on their business, or in this case, their flower shop that I was using as an example. I don't know if that makes sense.
No, that does. It's sort of like the business is that connection point that others would recognize. And the next time that they happen to be going into that local business, now it's like they've got this little better connection with who owns the business. They know them person a little better.
Well, and plus you have to remember, they're only on one episode. A sponsor is on, episode after episode after episode. So it's not like they're getting, they might get a little bit of free advertisement, but it's not, every episode. One thing I always wanted to do goes back to the farmer's market thing, where, I would go week after week to the farmers markets and I would see all these people selling whatever it was they made. But it was like, I didn't really know them. It's like, well, who is this person? What drives them to create? What motivates them? What a lot of people, I don't know how it is in your area of town, but a lot of these people, they go to work during the day and then they stay up all night doing whatever their passion project is. And there's something that drives them to do that. Normal people don't do that. Most people I know, they work during the day and they just come home and sit at night and watch TV all night. That's what I think most people do. People aren't going home and trying to perfect their, cookie baking or whatever, how to make the best burritos or cinnamon rolls that they're going to sell at farmers market that weekend. So I want to know, well, what's driving you to create? What's making you do it, what you do? And that's really what I've always wanted to do with I Am Salt Lake. And I think it's done a pretty good job of doing that.
By the way, Podcast Local has a sponsor, and it was wondering, have you seen the Satchel Player?
Yeah, I actually I submitted I Am Salt Lake to it, and it's a great podcast app. I really hope a lot of people use it. I think it's a great resource.
Yeah, it's really cool that when you open it up and then you're looking to discover podcasts, it's like right there, it says local. By taking your location, knowing where you are, suddenly you can discover, wow, there's like several podcasters around me doing podcasts. And some are local shows, but some are more just like, this is where they are. And this is where they produce their topical worldwide podcast. But it's interesting to be able to meet local podcasters that way.
Oh, absolutely. When I started I Am Salt Lake, almost 5 years ago now, I couldn't find any local podcasts. I didn't even know if anybody else did a local podcast out there. I did Google searches. I did iTunes searches. A lot of them were older shows that only did like 2 or 3 episodes. And so by having an app like Satchel, I think is going to connect a lot of us local podcasters together. And then it's great to see the direction that local podcasts are going.
Now they've even connected their Satchel Player you can connect it to your Patreon account if you have that.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah, it's like making their show listener supported through Patreon, but now you can connect it with the Satchel Player if your listeners are using the Satchel Player, which I guess is one of those things that you want to promote the Satchel Player so that they can also make those contributions.
Absolutely. I think I could probably do a better job of promoting the Satchel Player on I Am Salt Lake. So because I don't know how many people use it, or if any listeners of my podcast even use Satchel. Hopefully they do.
The app is free. It works on an iPhone and an Android phone. You can get it and register your show at satchelplayer.com. All right, I saw somewhere where you said that you love interviewing. So I'm just curious, what do you most like about that?
I like getting to know somebody. I like finding out their story. I think a lot of people, they put people up on pedestals. They see people from a distance and they look at them and they say, oh, they have their whole life figured out. They're successful. Look at me, boo-hoo. I'm over here. Life is so hard on me. So I like to be able to sit down with somebody and just get to know them and find out their story and find out there's not a whole lot that's different about, that person and myself. And getting that one-on-one connection is something I love. It's almost like a rush. After a good interview, I'm just like, wow, I feel, revitalized. I feel like I kind of fed off a little bit of their energy. And it's pretty cool. It's one thing I like about interviews.
Do you consider yourself an extrovert or an introvert?
I would say a mixture of both. I think I'm kind of right down the middle. I think when I was younger, I was a lot more of an extrovert. As I've gotten older, I've definitely become more and more of an introvert. But I think I could play either roles pretty well.
How do you prepare for your interviews? Or do you even prepare? Or do you just wing it?
I know a lot of people, they will spend hours and hours and hours before they talk to somebody. They want to make every note and they want to make make sure everything is they've learned everything about that person that they're about to interview. But I learned this from another podcaster that was actually, it was one of the first podcasts that I was actually ever on, that I was interviewed on. And before he interviewed me, I'm giving him links, and I'm like, oh, you might want to check this out and learn this about me and do this and this before you interview me. And he said, you know what? The less I know about you, the better the interview will be, because I have to put myself in the position of the listener. The listener knows nothing about you. So if I don't know anything about you, I'm going to want to ask you more questions. And that really kind of hit home with me. I'm like, that makes a lot of sense. Because if you know everything about the person that you're about to interview, then how can you put it on the same level as whoever's listening to the podcast? I don't know if that makes sense to you at all, but it was like, wow, that really. So I like, I pull a few tidbits out. I'll take a look at their websites or their Facebook. But after doing, I've done probably close to 275 interviews now, and there's so many questions that can be used for the same people to pull out the same, different answers, and the same style, whether you're talking to a musician or a comedian or a business owner or an artist or an author. And so you don't really, I could probably do a better job researching, maybe a little bit, but I kind of like going in and pretending I'm a listener that knows nothing about them.
Now, do you feel, though, that you're able to do that now because of the nearly 300 interviews that you've done? If you look back at your first 20 or 30, was it more difficult then to have that kind of engagement when you're talking with them?
Oh, absolutely. To be honest with you, I still go prepared with pages of notes. You can ask anybody that knows me. Before a podcast interview, I will still go in with pages and pages of notes. Will I refer to any of them? Probably not. Because what happened, I forgot what interview. I would say this was probably about episode 4 or 5. I remember going and doing an interview, and after about 10 minutes, I had no more questions to ask them because they answered them in such a way that it didn't really offer a lot of open-endedness to it. And it was like, I felt like a deer in headlights. So I told myself after that moment, I would go in with pages of notes and pages of thoughts and stuff like that. But typically, very rarely will I ever refer to those notes. They're just there for security, and it's worked out pretty well that way.
So, do you ever tell your guests what kinds of questions you're going to ask them?
If they ask me, I'll tell them. Usually I'll refer to them to listen to an episode or two of I Am Salt Lake. I'll say, hey, go back and listen to a couple episodes. It'll kind of give you an idea. I said pretty much I like just an organic conversation. I want to find out about you and basically finding out your story. Not really giving them any questions. One thing I've discovered through the years, though, of doing this is it might not be a bad thing to give them some questions, because it might give them a little bit of an opportunity to think about those questions and be able to give you a better answer than if you just kind of asked them spur of the moment. Because I think sometimes people, they get nervous. I don't know how it is in any interviews you've done, but a lot of times people, once they get behind that microphone, they freeze up. So it's helpful to know a little bit beforehand. But I've never given them, these are questions. I kind of just tell them, like, hey, we're just going to be talking about your life, obstacles that you've gone through, how you've gotten to where you're at today, that kind of thing. So, and that seemed to work out pretty good so far, at least.
Well, I'm curious now, how was it going from doing a solo show to adding your co-host?
So when I started I Am Salt Lake, it was never intended to be a solo show. I always wanted to bring somebody else onto the podcast and co-host the podcast with me. I just never found the right person. And as time went on, I eventually a good friend of mine, Ryan, he co-hosted probably about, 8 to 10 episodes with me. He was unemployed at the time, and he just kind of set in and eventually started chiming in more and more. That kind of fizzled away. But since then, I've brought in Chrissy, who we were dating when I first brought her in, and now we're engaged. It's been an interesting struggle because anytime you're used to doing things one way and then you bring somebody else in, you have to kind of learn to adjust that. And I could be very set in my ways. And I'm sure she's laughing at that right now if she's listening to this. But it's been a good part of the adventure for me because, like I told her, I said, I don't know where all of this podcasting thing is going to take me, and I need to learn to work with somebody else. I need to work with a co-host. And so I like it for that. It gives me a challenge to share the microphone with somebody else. Plus, it's nice to have a co-host because a lot of times she'll have questions that I might not even think of. Mm. You know, she brings a different energy to the show. She is much more lighthearted and humorous sometimes than I can be. I mean, she used to be very heavily involved in the local stand-up comedy scene here in Salt Lake. And so she has that funny side to her. And a lot of times I'll get on the microphone and I'll get all business-like and, be all, and she just sits back and just, has fun. And so I like it. It helps me relax. It brings a fun energy to the show. And I think it's worked out really well, actually. And I couldn't have picked a better co-host for the podcast.
It's interesting. I have mentioned you a few times. I mentioned you to Dave Jackson as some examples of the ways you can do local podcasts. And I have just been paying attention to you, and it's like I have seen something in the way you do it that you seem to be really making that connection. You're really connecting with the people of Salt Lake. And, well, even your title, the name of your show it's almost like this declaration. It's not just you saying, I am Salt Lake, but it's like everyone who comes on the show, everyone who listens to the show, it's like they can make that declaration too. I am Salt Lake. I am what this community is about. It just seems like it's going really, really well. Well,
thank you. I'm glad somebody kind of has been able to see that from a distance, because that's really what the show is all about. I mean, originally when I started it, I always thought it would be fun. Each person that came on the show would be like, my name is, Frank Dalton and I am Salt Lake. They would end each show that way because especially Salt Lake City isn't the biggest city in the world. It's actually a very small community. And when you have a small community, each person in that community plays a very major role in making that community great. And without, this person, maybe this wouldn't have happened. Or this person, got inspired from this person. And it just becomes a chain effect where each person is really what's making the city great. And if that person wouldn't be doing what they're doing, who knows where Salt Lake City or, Dallas or LA, each city, it has people like that. And we need to kind of spotlight those people and give them a chance to tell their story. And that's what I try to do, one episode at a time.
Would you say that your target audience is everyone who lives in Salt Lake? Is that who you would hope eventually would be listening to your show?
Originally, I kind of, I focused kind of the counterculture. That's kind of where, the people that aren't of the dominant religion or people that kind of live, just they're just normal people. They don't shop local. They aren't really familiar with the local music scene. That was originally the people I thought I would target. But as time has gone on, I've realized everybody can benefit from this podcast. A lot of people don't know about a lot of these other things going on. And so through I Am Salt Lake, I'm hoping to educate them, help them find out about what's going on, help them find out a lot. You'd be surprised how many people here don't even know about our weekly downtown farmers market in the summertime, even though It takes up a huge city block in the middle of downtown. It's hard to miss, but so many people don't even know about that. And so I think a lot of people can use I Am Salt Lake as a resource. There was a guy who emailed me. This was a couple years ago now, but he said he found my podcast through iTunes. He was doing searches. He was up for a job promotion that was going to transfer him. I believe it was Dallas or Salt Lake City. And he said, I found your podcast. I started listening to the show, and I felt like I was, right there in the city, and I felt like I got to find out about all these things going on there. And I chose to move to Salt Lake because of your podcast. And I thought, man, that is really cool. I originally kind of wanted to reach out to just, the other, Salt Lake City, obviously a lot of people think of, the religion that's here, the Mormons, and I'm not Mormon, but I wanted to kind of show people that were kind of similar to me that there was other things, but then to kind of hear the message from this other guy of being like, you're actually painting a really cool picture of Salt Lake, and you're making me learn about all this stuff. I was like, well, anybody, even if they live here, they can learn about these great resources, maybe a great place to get a haircut, or, somebody who makes jewelry, or about a local comedy club, or whoever. I think it's just a great resource personally.
Well, it's interesting, too, as I've followed what you have done, that you said you began with lots of photos and Instagram and that type of thing. So then you were doing the podcast, but you've done some live shows. I wonder if you could elaborate on some of those and how that worked out.
There is a club in downtown Salt Lake City where one of the owners contacted me, and he said, well, I'd really like you to do a live podcast here. And I've heard of podcasts that do live shows, and it always seemed like that would be a good idea, but it's not like I've seen a lot of them in action. So I didn't know, how a lot of them do live shows. And I was like, well, how would I really do I Am Salt Lake in a live setting? I mean, does somebody really want to come and watch me interview one person for an hour? And after talking with other podcasters, they gave me some ideas of, well, what if you were to do something like a David Letterman style, where you bring on 3 or 4 people and you talk to them for 10 to 15 minutes each, and you bring them out one at a time, and eventually all 3 or 4 of you are talking, and maybe even ask them more lighthearted questions like, how would you survive a zombie apocalypse? Or how would you, if you could go back to your first day of high school, what advice would you give? Where they're not so questions that make people tense up in front of an audience. And the first ever one that I did, it was amazing. I mean, about 200 people came out to it. The guy who owned this bar created this stage for podcasters. I mean, he loved podcasts, and he was hoping to get a lot of podcasters, touring podcasts or local podcasts to do it. So it was a perfect setting. I had the time of my life. I had a local comedian open up, and then I had 3 different guests on the show, and it was a success. I booked another one a few months later, and it's just kind of been one after another. It's a lot of work, a lot of time, to promote it and stuff like that. Since then, that bar has kind of closed its door, and so I can't do it there anymore. I've tried a few other different venues, and it's a lot of work and a lot of money out of my pocket, and I don't really see a whole lot of financial return. It's great to connect with listeners. It's a great way to meet new listeners. It's so fun after the show to get people coming up to you and saying, oh, I've been listening to your show for 2-3 years now. I really love it. I mean, that's really cool, and that's very rewarding, but it's also very exhausting as well to do it, but it's a lot of fun.
So if you were to compare, finances aside, do you prefer the live, or do you prefer doing the podcast?
I like an audience. I mean, because I like to get the energy from the audience. I also like when I do a live show, we open it up at the very end for audience questions. And so that's a lot of fun because you don't know what kind of questions they'll throw at you. And just meeting people and connecting with people. So I would say the live shows. One thing that we've done since we got an office space is we have a little bit of extra room in here with a couch and stuff, and we've invited people into our weekly recordings to come and hang out while we record. And sometimes we've even invited them onto the microphone if they have any questions for whoever we're talking to. And that's been a lot of fun as well because, when you have 3 or 4 people watching on your weekly recordings, it kind of makes it a little bit live, even though they have to be quiet. But I like doing it in front of people. We've been meaning to start like Facebook Living it or something, some sort of live videoing it, just because I like being able to interact with our listeners that way.
Now, do you edit your podcast?
I do. I used to be a lot more picky. I used to try to, clean it up and, every and end and this and that. I would try to take that out. Since then, I've kind of relaxed, and I've realized that a lot of that is just kind of the way conversations flow. And so it's been a lot less pressure on me. It used to take me 6-8 hours to edit a 1-hour show. And I really learned to relax a lot. If you go back to really early episodes, I would take out even every little breath, every little pause. And sometimes that's needed for the conversation.
Yes.
But yeah, I edited up a little bit. I wouldn't say I don't edit as much as I used to.
So what, you mentioned that you started out with your iPhone to record, and what's your technology now? What kind of mics and software do you use?
So my setup, I've always wanted to be fairly portable, because that was kind of the idea. It goes back to the beginning. I always thought it would be fun to just kind of travel around Salt Lake, go into people's businesses, and record on the spot. Since I've come into an office place where we have a permanent location, my setup is still very portable. I use an H6 Zoom recorder to record all my interviews into. I record on an SD card, which then I will pop into my laptop, which I use a MacBook. And I still use Audacity to do any kind of editing, stitching together. I'm trying to learn some other editing programs, but I think since I've used Audacity for 5 years, it's what I'm familiar with. And I think it works great. But, you always hear about all these pros and stuff that are, the professionals that are using, Adobe Audition or Pro Tools or Hindenburg. And so I always thought it would be neat to try to learn some of those other programs, just even because I'm a guy that likes to kind of constantly be teaching myself. But I use Audacity. It works great. My microphones, I use ATR 2100 mics just because, again, that was what was recommended by Dave Jackson. And I've liked them. I've always liked the sound that they provide. They're inexpensive microphones. I like that they can plug in with an XLR adapter or a USB adapter, and that's my setup. And then I have just like one of those microphone amplifiers. That way everybody can wear a headset while we record, especially if you're in a noisy area or whatnot. And it's pretty simple. It's pretty an easy setup. I'd like to get more technical, but why change it if it's not broken, right?
Yeah, I guess it makes sense. I'm using Audacity as well. When you consider all the different aspects of podcasting, from the tech to technique, what parts do you like best and what parts do you like the least?
I think the thing I like the most is it goes back to connecting with people. I like meeting new people. I like finding out about them. I like creating friendships. I like being able to share my story alongside with their story. I'm the type of person where when I die, I want to be remembered. I don't want to just be forgotten and just be another person. I want to leave my legacy. I want to leave my stamp on the world. And I think through podcasting, that's helping me do that. I look back over the, 4.5, close to 5 years of audio that I've created, and I'm like, wow, that's pretty cool. That's out there for the world. And so I would say that's probably what I like the most. What I like the least, the time it takes me away from family and friends and stuff like that. And then, if something breaks, you're like, man, I got to dig into my pocket and buy a new microphone or a new recorder. So that's probably what I like the least.
Are there any parts of podcasting that you would actually like to get better at? Or have you arrived?
Well, no, I don't know if this really answers your question, but one thing I'd like to get better at, I'm always impressed with people that are able to do a solo podcast. I'm sure you've listened to them. I mean, again, you've talked about Dave Jackson a few times. I find that so impressive to me that somebody can get on the microphone and just talk. There's nobody else there. There's nobody else in the room, and they're able to just talk and share their story and talk for an hour. I mean, I don't know if you've ever listened to Bill Burr's podcast. He can just talk for an hour. And it's like, to me, that just that experience of being on the microphone, that comfortableness, I guess. I mean, that would be something I would like to get better at. I'd also like to get better at figuring out the business side of podcasting.
Is there anything that we haven't talked about that you would like to share with other local podcasters?
I think the biggest thing that local podcasters can learn, one thing that I've learned, is how important it is to be part of your community. When I started I Am Salt Lake, and especially when I was going through a divorce, through a big chunk of it, I kind of isolated myself. I kept myself inside. I didn't really go out and be part of the community. But I think as a local podcaster, we have a resource that a lot of other podcasters can only dream of, where all of our listeners are right outside our door. And we need to learn to take advantage of that, whatever that is, whether that's going and introducing yourself to local business owners, or it's going and seeing a local band, or a parade, or whatever local events are going on. We need to take advantage of that. I know sometimes it's hard with our day-to-day lives. We can't get out there, or we're not comfortable doing that. And everybody's at a different level. So you need to find, where are you at? What can you do? But I think it's important. One thing Chrissy and myself, we like to do, we'll find ourselves, okay, where do we want to, let's go get a bite to eat. Well, let's find a new local restaurant that we haven't tried. And so you kind of want to put yourself out there, keep connecting with the community, because our listeners are in our own backyards, and sometimes we forget that.
All right. I really appreciate you coming on the show and sharing your experiences and your insight and your advice.
Thank you so much, Jason. I mean, this has been a great opportunity for me. A lot of times I don't get an opportunity to share myself, to kind of share a little bit of my story. And so to kind of have the microphones reversed, it's been a fun experience. And so thank you for inviting me to come on your podcast. I think what you do is a great thing as well. And so hopefully people take their time to go back and check out some of your back episodes. You've been hard at work as well, creating some great podcast episodes. So hopefully, if people, maybe some of my audience has come here and are listening right now, take a moment and check out some of the back episodes of Podcast Local.
You can learn more about Chris Holifield and I Am Salt Lake at iamsaltlake.com. You can subscribe to his show on your iPhone or Android device and connect on social media. That's iamsaltlake.com. By the way, Would you like to start your own local podcast? There's an on-the-go guide for that. 7 ways you can tell the stories of your community. There's also a guide for using your iPhone as a field recorder so you can interview on the go. The on-the-go guides are free and they are designed to kickstart your creativity. Get them at podcastlocal.com. I'm Jason Norris, and thank you for listening to Podcast Local from On The Go FM.